This morning we're going to be looking in the book of Luke, chapter 6. And we're only going to be looking at 3 verses. I'm going to mention a few more, but those are the 3 verses I want to look at. And this is the third part in our 4 spiritual goals for 2015 series. And this is the third one, so next week there will be one more. But today I want to just read from Luke chapter 6, verses 36 through 38. And my sermon this week is entitled, Give More. The first part of the sermon series was Read Your Bible More. Last week was Pray More. And this week is Give More. Let me read Luke 6, 36 through 38 to you. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. One of my favorite pastors of all time pastored up in Van Nuys, California, just up towards the valley from here. And I used to go to his church whenever I could in seminary, and later on, after I got married, and my wife and I had a little bit of a sabbatical when we came back from Philadelphia. And we used to visit his church because we were living quite close to it. And so it was church on the way, and it was Pastor Jack Hayford. I don't know if some of you know him, but he was this phenomenal guy. And I remember going to this one conference that he had. Just the timing was just perfect for me to go. And I went to this conference, and he began the conference by making this really amazing claim. And what he said and he asked this question, he said, do you know what the key to everything in your life is? And so for me, I respect this guy. I love his preaching. I love the ministry that he did. He was a man of integrity, and he's one of those ones that you could see regularly. Got to shake his hand a few times. It was the closest that I had to kind of like star, kind of thing for me. But anyway, I had a chance to interact with him a little bit. And when he was preaching the sermon, I remember writing it down, and I remember talking with him afterwards. But basically what he said is the key to everything, and I was just waiting. And in my back of my mind, I was guessing what it was going to be. Love, grace, something, I was thinking about that, and he said, is giving. And when he said that, I was kind of a little bit put off because I thought, wait a minute, is he going to talk now about giving money? Is he going to talk about, is he actually going to come down a few notches in my eyes? Because I was just so expecting something, a little bit more, I don't know, touchy-feely, a little bit more ephemeral, a little bit more esoteric. I don't know what I was expecting, but when he said the word giving, it just kind of didn't ring with me. It didn't quite make sense with me. But then as he began to unfold his message and his talk, I began to see exactly what he was. If you go to John chapter 3, verse 16, you guys are all familiar with that verse. Let me read it to you in the ESV. You don't have to look it up, but just listen. Let's listen very carefully what it says. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And this is out of context. There's so much more, but we always focus on the fact that God so loved the world that he gave his Son, right? But actually it should be, for God so loved this world that the active action of his love meant that he had to give his Son. See, to say, from up in heaven, God says, oh, I love you so much. I feel for you guys so much. You guys are all trapped in sin. Oh, well, I'll come back a few thousand years later. No. God looks down, and his love is such that the definition of his love is that the quality of his love is that it cannot not give his only Son. Those two, in the economy of God's love, are inextricably tied together. His love means, by definition, that giving must follow. If you guys just get that understanding this morning, then I think you begin to understand an aspect of God's love, of God's grace, that is so important. It's not something that you haven't heard, but you have to put those two things together, because if you don't, then you're going to miss out on this real deep nuance and this real deep trait and characteristic of God's love. It must be a love that gives. See, there are all kinds of selfish love that we can see out in the world. There's a lot of love that's motivated because of what I get. A lot of people are in relationships with, with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, even a husband or a wife, because of what they get out of it. Not so much to give. Not so much to give. So there's all kinds of models of selfish love. And I see so many people who say that they're Christian and that they love God. All they want is God's forgiveness. All they want is God's grace. All they want is a ticket to heaven. All they want is all the things and the blessings that God can give them. But they don't think about how that should transform them, and they should now be instruments of giving. If you are not a giver, if your life isn't becoming more about giving than receiving, then you are not picking up the characteristics of Jesus Christ. Then you are not understanding the depth of God's love. You're not emulating it. And it's a hard a measurement to put ourselves up against, because God gives his only Son, and Jesus gives up his very life for us. But it's the measurement and the standard by which we need to examine our Christian lives. It's really, really, really important. And so, in a sense, in this series, when I'm saying give more, this is not any less than pray or read the Word. It's now actually beginning the part of where we're starting to act, where the rubber meets the road, and where we really need to work upon these truths. And so when we look at this passage, to me, it's very interesting because, Jesus is not talking so much about money or serving and all these things. All of those things flow out of having an attitude of giving, an attitude of love that can't help but give. And so when you look at this, it has a few things that I want to give you prescriptions on, and they're kind of similar and kind of related, but I want to break it down, each one, because these are all practical things in which you can give this week. Okay? That you're going to be faced with choices whether to give or not give. It happens all the time. And if you begin to look at this and unpack this a little bit, you'll find that just beginning today, you're going to have an opportunity to give or to withhold. You're going to have an opportunity to give love or not. And so I want you to really look at and understand these very practically. Here's what Jesus says. He says, in the very beginning, he says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful. What's mercy? The characteristic of mercy is giving pardon. That's the simplest way to put it. That we pardon others. Okay, and I want to be a little bit technical here. I think it's kind of a forensic, legal kind of a definition, but that's where I wanted to keep it. The thing is that mercy is that when someone has done wrong, that person knows it, you know it, and somehow you have the power, or you're in the situation to either pardon them or to hold them accountable for their actions. And usually that person is desiring mercy. They're repentant. They're sorry. And you have the power, and you're looking at the whole situation, because sometimes that involves other people and involves organizations. And so in that situation, especially when you're a leader or you're in a position of power, whether or not you pardon them or not is going to affect the organization. It's going to affect that person's life. It's going to affect a lot of things. And it's interesting because God is a person. God in his nature is one who is merciful. In Isaiah 55:7, it says, let the wicked forsake his way. So I think there's a precondition of them turning away from their evil. Let the unrighteous man his thoughts, turn away from his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. He will abundantly pardon. In Louis Palau's book, Experiencing God's Forgiveness, he shares this story about Napoleon Bonaparte. And you guys probably heard about Napoleon, but I don't know if you ever heard this story. But one of the things about his army was that his soldiers loved him. They just loved him. They would just die for him, literally. He was this very charismatic leader, and he would really pay attention to them. He would get off his horse, and he would go among the people, among his men, and he would go in there, and he would remember people's names and talk to them, and he would encourage them, and he said, yes, the battle that's coming up, we're going to win. And he was a very charismatic, very loving, in a sense, as a leader there, and so they really enjoyed it. But there was a case where there was a young man who committed the same offense twice. The first time, they kind of let it slide. But the second time, he said, for the whole sake of the army, this offense is one that justice in which our military justice demands death. And so the day was set, he was going to be executed, and Napoleon didn't want to do it, but he had no choice for the morale of the whole, army. But the mother of that soldier found out and came before Napoleon, and here's what he said. I plead for mercy. I don't seek justice. I plead for mercy. And Napoleon said he committed this thing twice. He does not deserve mercy. And here's what she said. Sir, it would not be mercy if he deserved it, and mercy is all I ask for. Napoleon said, well then, I will have mercy. It's a choice. It's a decision. And so here where it says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful, that's the characteristic of God. And so when we give pardon, and pardon is recognizing that that was a sin and recognizing that this person has turned around. And even though for the sake of the whole company or all the others that are involved, it may not be fair or right, you're willing because you have the power, and so he does so. And God does that for us. And there are situations where it'll be true for us, and then we need to give out mercy. In a practical sense, it can happen anywhere, at a restaurant. It could happen wherever you go. I mean, there's times when I have a decision either to get upset or angry at someone for taking away my right or doing something to me, or in that instant, I can be merciful and just say, you know what? I'm going to let that go. The second thing that comes out here, Jesus says, and these are all kind of going to run over one another a little bit, but it says, judge not, and you will not be judged. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Now, there's one thing about judging that I want to make clear. I think I've mentioned this before, but judging is very distinct. And so here what we're doing is we're giving people the benefit of the doubt. We're giving them the benefit of the doubt. We don't know if they were wrong. We don't know if they were guilty. We don't know necessarily, and we don't have the perspective or all the information to do that. And what Jesus is saying is, don't conclude ahead of time. Don't make judgments ahead of time. Now, does that mean that whatever anybody does, we go, well, maybe there's something I don't know? No, that's not what I'm saying. You can confront someone. You can, talk with someone, and you can have even a confrontation with someone about a specific act without judging them. Because then you go up and say, I don't know why you did this, but I'd like to know why. Because here's how that affected me. You guys see? But a lot of times, instead, what we do is like, that person's such a jerk, or we talk to somebody else usually, or that person did this, and we already assume what their motivation and their reasoning and everything was. And so judging is quite different than what we normally think of it as. See, we never know what the situation was. We never know how hard he or she might have tried not to do that. We don't know. Now, I mean, I'll give you an example. Sometimes when you go to a crowded parking lot somewhere and you're looking for a parking spot, right? And right when you get there, the car comes out of that spot, but they come out the wrong way, so they block you and another car just zips in, right? What do you think? What do you say? I don't know. Maybe I don't want to hear what you say, but what are you thinking at the time? I mean, for me, I get frustrated too, but then I think about it sometimes and I think, okay, so these are the imaginations. I go, okay, well, maybe they didn't see me, right? But then I go like, I'm too logical. Of course they see me. I have a big SUV here, And I think, oh, maybe their kid had to go to the bathroom. Maybe there's some other extent, or maybe, whatever thoughts would come through our mind. But at that moment to say, that person's a jerk. That person is just pure evil. That person's just, just to make all these conclusions and to judge them, I think that's something that we have to be very, very wary of and careful of. We get to choose whether or not we're going to give the benefit of the doubt on a day-by-day basis or not. You say, well, that person does that all the time, so, I can't give them the benefit of the doubt anymore. You know what Jesus says about kind of the benefit of the doubt or forgiving? He says, not just once, not just 7 times, but 7 times 70. He says, over and over and over again, to the point where you look like a fool. To the point where you look like the one that's just very stupid and foolish. But we're not being. We're saying, God, I trust you so much, and I believe your word that you are the one that's going to judge rightly, correctly, at the right time. And so I leave it up to you. Now, does that mean when you see someone doing something wrong that you just stand by and go like, well, I can't judge? No, that's not what I'm saying. There's some things that are just obvious. If someone's, beating up somebody, or someone's abusing their child or something like that, of course. But at the same time, you have to let God deal with all of those things, but you need to go in there and help and do something about that situation and that scenario, but you still have to be open in your mind about what's going on and not come to conclusions. And you have to leave it up to God. The only thing that I think the Bible says about this is that it is up to God to judge. In Romans 2:16 it says, on that day, and when is that day? When we're all before God in heaven, when everything is all done, it says, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. There will come a day when everything will be judged, but it'll be done by God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5, therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his condemnation from God. Don't worry. The people that don't repent, the people that do horrible, doesn't mean we shouldn't stop criminals. It doesn't mean we shouldn't stop evil. It doesn't mean we shouldn't fight against that. It doesn't mean that, as a nation, we shouldn't go and fight injustice and cruelty, and we shouldn't prevent whole nations and peoples from being wiped out. Of course not. That's not what I'm saying. But in terms of judging the intention and the thoughts and the minds and the reasons behind people's heart, God says it will eventually be done. And he will do it. The next thing that comes out is condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Well, when someone has wronged you, what do? In that instant, you have a choice to make. Either give leniency. I know this sounds all like a pardon and all these other things, but it's slightly different. Because when you're condemning, you're saying, man, that person did me wrong, and I condemn this and that. And it's not only judging, it's now declaring that they should now be ostracized, or you should no longer hang out with them, or we should kind of put them out of our fellowship, or something to that effect. It's not just judging, but it's also sentencing them to some kind of judgment or penalty, something to that effect. There was an article a number of years ago, and they reproduced this in this one Christian magazine. And I thought it was such an interesting thing. But there was a guy who had, just before he started his first year, matriculated at Texas A&M. He was a kind of an ROTC cadet corps, and he was there for all the hazing that they did. And so this guy named Bruce Goodrich was forced to run, and he kept running and running in the middle of the night in his shorts until he dropped. But the problem was he didn't get back up. He actually died that night before he even started his first day of college. A little bit after that, the whole student body, showed out and, wrote all these things to the family and all the condolences, whatever. And the father of this young man wrote a letter, and he said this: I would like to take this opportunity to express the appreciation of my family for the great outpouring of concern and sympathy from Texas A&M University and the college community over the loss of our son, Bruce. We were deeply touched by the tribute paid to him by the battalion. We are particularly pleased to note that his Christian witness did not go unnoticed during his brief time on campus. And here's where he had every right to condemn. Here's where he had every right to do all these things and just pour out all his angst and anger at the hazing that went on. And he said, I hope it will be some comfort to know that we harbor no ill in this matter. I don't know how a father says that, but he understands this word of Jesus Christ about condemn not. We know our God makes no mistakes. Bruce had an appointment with his Lord and is now secure in his celestial home. When the question is asked, why did this happen? Perhaps one answer will be, so that many will consider where they will spend eternity. You get a hint of what happens when we begin to give and love and live like Jesus Christ. That people now begin to wonder about you. about what you believe and what you're living for. The next one, it says, forgive and you will be forgiven. This is when we give up our right to hold a grudge. Trust me, I think most of us, without knowing it, do so. When you get married, one of the things that you realize is, especially after you've been married for a long while, is whether or not, this is the easiest test of whether or not you're holding a grudge or you've truly forgiven your spouse. You get into an argument, and arguments tend to run in cycles, so you kind of revisit the same argument again, or at least it's similar, and it's something that still hasn't been resolved, so you come back to that argument and you argue about it. And in that moment, in your mind, all the times that person, well, not all, but a lot of the times that person has done and failed or whatever, those things start popping up in your mind. It happens. You can ask most married couples that have been married for a while. It happens. And at that moment, when you dispel all those things and say, nope, that's past. I don't care if it's a pattern. It's past. It's forgiven. Then that's when you know you've actually let it go and released it. But if it even comes out of your mouth and say, again, or this again, and then what's happening now is that you've not truly let it go. You've not truly released it. You're holding a grudge. And it happens with our parents. It happens with our children. It happens with our spouses. It happens with our siblings, our friends, our brothers and sisters. We may still love them, and we still be in great relationship with them, but there's this one thing, this root of this unforgiveness for that's there. Do you guys see what I'm talking about? And so when Jesus says, forgive and you will be forgiven, we need to give up this right to hold a grudge. And when we do that, there's power. That's when the gospel, that's when the love of God, that John 3:16 love of God begins to be lived out in your life. That's when your testimony and when you share the gospel becomes so powerful. I remember this story one of my professors shared about a seminary student back in the day, and I don't think it was actually even one of his students, but he was a bus driver, like a public bus driver as his part-time job in this bad part of town. And one time, in the very beginning when he started working, a bunch of teens got on board, and it was a really bad time, and they refused to pay the fare. And they said, what are you going to do about it? And so a few days later, the seminary student saw a policeman. He stopped the bus, and he said, these kids have been getting on the bus every day and not paying. And so he reported them. Officer made them pay, and then he got off. And when the bus went down the street a little bit more, those teens beat up and robbed this driver. So he pressed charges. It was easy to identify who they were, pretty obvious. They all got rounded up. And when they were being sentenced to jail, all of a sudden he had an inspiration, I don't know, from God or whatever. I don't know if I could have done this. And he felt pity for them. And so he asked the judge, because he remembered something like this about, I'm taking the penalty for somebody else. That's like Jesus. And he said, okay, I'm going to try this. He said, you know what? Can I take their sentences and in their stead? Just try. And then the judge was like, what? I've never heard of anything like this before. And then he said to those young men, it's because I forgive you, because God forgave me. And so the judge thought it over for a little while, and then he said, nope, your request is denied. And they all were put in jail for whatever amount of time. But then he went back and visited them in the jail. And several of them actually ended up accepting Jesus as their Savior. There's stories like that. Why? Because, see, when we give up our right to these things that we have, that the world says is our right, then we become made right in the image of God. Then we begin to see and live out the love of God. And then here's what Jesus says. He says, give. Now he says this word give, and I think he's summing up everything else that came before. And it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your life. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Can I say something that's really important? when we feel stuck or when we feel like the Spirit of God or, our spirituality's come to a kind of a standstill or a plateau, I think it's because we're not giving. We're not giving out grace. I'm not talking about money. I'm not talking about just time. All of that, of course, as well. But why do you give money? Not for the church, not for to pay my salary. We give money because we say, God, I want you to use this to further the work of your kingdom through our pastoral staff, through our local church that I'm a family of. Okay, great. And to raise up new leaders, all that. Okay, that's great. And we serve to see those young people grow up. So that's all part of giving. But all these things that came before, mercy, don't judge, don't condemn, forgive, all these things are daily choices of us giving up our rights, just like Jesus Christ gave up his very life. The one that had no sin, knew no sin, became sin that we could become pure and holy before God. And now we have that incredible privilege of doing it. But here's what it says. Give extravagantly. Give generously if you want to experience the Spirit of God flowing in your life. Maybe the best imagery that I can give you is this. We are to be streams of living water, not ponds of stagnant water. If you think about this very carefully, and this is the way the Christian life is supposed to be. If you want God to pour into your life, then you pour out of your life to others. You bless, you give it away. And as you do that, as you empty yourself, God pours more constantly in. And there's a flow and there's a motion that's to your life. But when you go like, oh, there's not enough. I'm barely having enough grace. I'm barely having enough of what God can give me to live my life. And you feel like you're just getting by day, then you're going to be stuck. There's an aqueduct that the Romans built in 109 AD. You guys know what an aqueduct is? The Romans were amazing engineers. And so they had running water. They had toilets with actual, that would take your refuse out of the houses. So these aqueducts would be these waters, stone aqueducts that were built miles and miles of them that would flow water, and then some of them would go under the buildings and around, and they would flow into the different buildings. There was this constant flowing water so that you would have running water in your houses, all mechanical, all by physics. And so in this town outside of Segovia in Spain, there was a Roman aqueduct that was built in 109 AD, and it was used until 1909. But then in 1909, they started going, oh, we have modern plumbing, and let's preserve this for the future, and so they shut off the water. They had all the modern plumbing going in, and it became a tourist attraction. And in the little less than 100 years, a little more than 100 years that they stopped using it as actual aqueducts, it started crumbling and decaying because it dried out. Isn't that an interesting imagery? Sometimes our spiritual lives are dry, and sometimes our spiritual lives are so, fruitless because we're stuck in not giving and not loving. It's crumbling because we're trying to hoard it or save it. We need to be very cautious and careful. The problem is not whether or not we're able to give. The problem is that we're not giving enough away. I know it's not easy, and this week you might be faced with this, but how do we give mercy? Because we remember God was merciful. How do we keep from judging? Because we realize that God chose not to judge us. How do we keep from condemning? Because God does not condemn us, but rather condemn Jesus Christ, and now we're free from condemnation. How do we forgive? Because we know that God will forgive us and has forgiven us. And we want to have a family resemblance to God our Father. Let us be people who love actively because we give.